Welcome to Aspects of Writing. I'm your host, James Kelly, and my guest for today is Paulette K, and my panelist is Janet Corsi. The topic of today's show is the importance of editing, but before we get to my guest, Jan, Paulette, and I would like to read a few fun quips and quotes about writing, and Jan, I'm going to let you start.
Okay. The writer who breathes more words than he needs is making a chore for the reader who reads. Dr. Seuss.
You can kind of tell that. And Paulette?
I love that.
I
That is
know.
so true.
That's so cool. And Paulette, I'll let you take the next one.
Okay, mine is writing without revising is the literary equivalent of waltzing gaily out of the house in your underwear. Patricia Fuller.
Let's hope not.
All right. And a professional writer is an amateur who didn't quit. That was by Richard Bach. If you're just tuning in, I'm your host, James Kelly, and my panelist is Janet Corsi. Our guest for today's show is Paulette K, and the topic is the importance of editing. Paulette is a professional book editor and writer for Platinum Editing Group, based in Denver, Colorado. Paulette spent 14 years in the legal field drafting and editing and proofreading documents for the Colorado District Courts, Colorado Court of Appeals, and the Colorado Supreme Court. 13 years ago, she decided to use her expertise and began working with individual authors to write and publish books. Paulette has worked with about 250 authors in a variety of genres, domestically and internationally. She is a sports nut, the Broncos, the Nuggets, the Rockets, the Avalanche, and even though she lives in Denver, Colorado, the Carolina Panthers.
Whoa.
On the weekends, Paulette can be found watching one or more of her three grandsons play football, basketball, or other sports. Paulette, how can someone contact you if they need an editor, and what did I leave out about you?
Well, I guess one thing that you maybe left out is that I have literally had a love affair with both words and sports from the time that I could walk and talk.
Okay.
So while I have had about 40 years experience in writing, which is what I usually tell people, really it's been much closer to 60.
Wow.
No way.
So if people would like to contact me, my telephone number is 303-517-7340, and my email address is Paulette@PlatinumEditingGroup, all one word, .com.
Right. And they can also contact you on Facebook.
Yes, so they can go to Facebook and just look for my company name, Platinum Editing Group, and it'll take you right to my page.
And also, we have a flyer up here in the studio for someone who's going to be, if anyone wants to see the flyer with your telephone number on there and your information, they can look at the video version of this show after they listen to the audio, and the video version will be posted on YouTube. And I got to quit these ums. All right, so Paulette, we've established that you're an editor, and you know that today we're going to be talking about editing, and we're all going to have varying opinions on various parts of the editing process, but we're going to actually go into, we're going to read 7 myths about editing. And this is taken from a blog written by David Cudler. Now, even though this is what he says, this doesn't mean it's etched in stone. That's why we're going to discuss it. And Paulette, I'm going to let you start with the first part of this, the first myth.
Okay, so the first myth is that a good writer does not need an editor. So in these days of self-publication and service publishers who take a percentage of sales for letting the author do all of the work, you hear this a lot. I've slaved over this manuscript for years. I've checked it through 100 times. Microsoft Word spelling and grammar comes up clean. Woo-hoo, my book is ready for publication.
Yeah, right.
Well, let's talk about that for a minute, because first of all, just because you went through Microsoft Word spelling or grammar doesn't mean that it's clean, because there's real problems with that. One is you can have a word spelled correctly, but that doesn't mean it's the correct word needed for the sentence.
Right, like where?
Right.
Yes, in addition to the Microsoft does not pick up like proper punctuation, For example, one of my very biggest issues for all of my authors is not knowing when and where to use commas.
Yes.
So sometimes where to use a comma is up to the author's discretion, but most times there is a right and a wrong way, or a right place and a wrong place to use a comma.
Yeah.
So that's one of the biggest issues that I see is proper punctuation.
And I'm going to let you read the rest of that as well, and we'll talk about it.
I will absolutely do that. Want an example of a professional book from a world-class author who convinced her publishers to put out the book as is, without a deep developmental edit. Look at J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix. Pretty good book. It sold millions of copies, absolutely. But it's at least 100 pages longer than it needs to be. There's needless repetition, uneven pacing, and side plots that go nowhere. You'll notice that the previous and subsequent books in the best-selling series were much shorter and much tighter. Rowling worked more closely with her editors.
And, there's a lot of examples of that as well. We've talked about the author who wrote 50 Shades of Grey, and everyone talks about how horrible it was written, but it's done so well. I mean, It's phenomenal, the number of copies sold. It was made into a movie. So it's possible to put something out there that's not grammatically correct or wordy, but for most books like that, you're going to go nowhere.
My very first book, I had like 3 chapters removed from it because my editor contacted me and says, Jan, what happens if these chapters go away? Does it change your story? Didn't change my story at all, but it kept the reader really reading once those chapters were gone, because it didn't slow them down.
Right.
And when you start slowing people down, that's when they lose interest in the book.
Yeah.
Well, that's exactly right. One of my jobs as your editor is to help you keep the pacing of your book at a place where the reader is compelled to keep turning the pages.
Right.
And if you have big chunks, paragraphs, chapters of content of text that does not advance the story, that does not move the story forward, it needs to be deleted. And that's one of the things that your editor can see that you as the author can't see.
Exactly.
Because you're so close to your material that you can't see the forest for the trees.
Exactly.
So when your editor reads the book for the first time, text or content that does not move the story forward is going to be very, very evident to your editor, whereas you as the author can't see that most times.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yep.
And I'm going to let you finish reading that as well, Paulette.
Okay. So here's the fact. If you want your book to be strong, clean, professional, and appealing for it to affect the readers as you want it to affect them, it needs to be professionally edited. There has never, and I repeat, never been a book written that did not need editing. That includes Stephen King, John Grisham, Dr. Phil.
Right.
I don't care who you are.
Right.
Yep.
By the time you've spent weeks, months, or years on a project, you as the author can't see the words anymore. You can see the ideas, the concepts, arguments, plot, and characters, but not every word that's on the page, or that even isn't, or where there are gaping holes in logic or jumps in style. An editor does. This is what your editor is paid to do.
Right. And you know what? I want to bring up 2 examples. I've used this example before, but I had a friend who had a PhD who went to get their dissertation, and they had already majored in English. They had a degree in English. But when they did their PhD, they realized, I do need someone to look over this, because
Absolutely.
anyone who's going to read that PhD and critique it is going to pick it apart if there's 1 or 2 errors. So they hired someone to read the PhD. And the other one is that oftentimes when people I know that read a lot. When I used to work at one of the hotels, someone I used to go to lunch with would read during lunch. She constantly picked apart. We're talking about books by major authors
Yes.
that had errors in it. And so if there's errors in a book that comes out by a traditional publisher, you can imagine what kind of errors would be in a book by someone who's self-published if they don't have it edited properly. And they're going to look at it the same way they would look at any book they read.
Yes.
So it's very important to make sure that everything is the way it should be before you put it out.
Yes.
James, another excellent example of that. If you look at Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code,
Yes.
the word slowly is, I think, used 12 times in the first 3 pages. And I think there's an introduction or a prologue or a very short first chapter. I think the first chapter or whatever it is only about 3 pages long. But the word slowly, which there's 2 problems with that. The first is that it's a Lee word, and we try to stay away from using Lee words. But second of all, like, which reader wants to read the word slowly 12 times, and I don't think I'm exaggerating, 12 times in 3 pages.
Right.
That's somebody doing something slowly 4 times on every page of the first 3 pages of the book. Yeah. So, you can say something other than slowly. You can say inched. You can say edged. There's millions of words that you can use that aren't the same repeated word, but that also aren't ly words. We call them Lee words. So that, I mean, when I read the Da Vinci Code and noticed the word slowly 12 times in 3 pages, I said to myself, regardless of how good this story is, this book is going to be a nightmare to get through because of word repetition, and word repetition is not interesting.
Yeah. Oh, I have something to add to that too, Paulette, in the sense that I'm that way, and you have edited one of my books, which I haven't finished up yet. But anyway, the thing is that I have a tendency to, and I'm glad you caught that I'm repetitive with some words. And mine's not as repetitive what you just said with some of the words, but just 2 or 3 times within the same page can be sometimes something someone will pick up on it and be annoyed with. I would say the average reader probably isn't going to pick up on that. Probably the people who read all the time are the type people who are going to pick up on that,
right,
and be annoyed with it. I know my first novel, I think I used the word as, at least 1,200 times. And when I went back and read it, was like annoyed with it. So... and I think that's the importance of an editor, to pick up on words that we do use repetitively so that we can, when we go back and re-edit what the editor's done, we can change that around. That's very important.
Yeah. And I think sometimes, too, once we've written something and we've read it and reread it and reread it, pretty soon we're not actually looking at the words and reading the words that we've actually written.
Right.
We're reading what's in our heart, in our brain, of what we want it to say.
Well, we look at it from a different perspective than the editor does.
Right.
Because we're just putting the words on paper and we're trying to convey a story. Then the editor has to take that and have it make sense.
Right.
Give it James, rhythm. That's the first thing is, I call that the I know what I meant syndrome.
Right.
To Jan's point, because Jan is exactly right. Since we've seen our words so many times, we start seeing not what's on the page, but what's in our head.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. We visualize it when we're writing it. So the hard part is getting it conveyed on paper, what we see in our mind.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, Jan, I'm going to let you take the next one.
Myth number 2. I don't need the expense of paying an editor. Yeah, right. I had my wife, dad, neighbor, high school English teacher read it through, and they didn't find anything.
Okay, let's stop right there, because I had an author, and you know this author. We're not mentioning names, though, Paulette. But I had an author. This is how we met. I had an author who had a book. It was quite lengthy anyway. But I had an author who we tried to convince to have it re-edited. The problem was his wife edited the book. And it's really touchy when you're dealing with someone who a family member or something has already touched the book.
Yes.
Whether they've done the cover or they've done the editing.
Yes.
But in the process of the editing, I actually, before you ever met this person, Paulette, had tried to convince this person maybe we need to send it to someone for proofreading. Because then if we send it to a proofreader and they convince you that maybe you need editing, it helps to have someone proofread it.
Right.
And that person didn't want me to do that. They ended up doing a book signing close to where you live. You happen to be the person who went to that book signing, and you happen to be the only person who bought that book. And you wrote back a critique to this person in a very nice way, but letting them know that there were a lot of mistakes in this book. But the sad thing was because this person's wife is a teacher, they were convinced that it didn't need any more editing. And plus, this person had technical background, let's just put it that way. So they also had intelligence, or at least book learning.
Right.
So they felt like it's already been edited enough. And I'm going to let you speak about that, Paulette, but please don't mention the name or the book.
No, I absolutely won't. But I can tell you, at the time that I bought that book, my youngest grandson was in first grade, so he was a relatively new reader. My next grandson, I think, was in third grade, and my oldest grandson in fifth grade or whatever. But one of the things that I could not help but think when I was reading this book is that there were so many errors in that book that would make my first grade reader cringe. and I am not kidding you. There was error after error after error. But one specifically that comes to my mind is that this author in his book said something about a desert wine. And I read that and I said, "Oh, dude, you mean a dessert wine."
Yeah.
And that book was just absolutely replete with error after error, such as that. And it would have been a very simple matter for this person to have hired an editor from his former profession. I don't have any doubt that he very well could have afforded to pay an editor.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
And his book would have been a viable product in the marketplace. But
Right, it was a
James
good story,
said,
yeah.
As James said, I was apparently the only person who bought his book at the book signing where I met him. And I bought his book solely because I'm a book editor. I work with first-time authors every single day. And when I find an author who is selling his book at a book signing, I like to support self-published authors. But I can tell you, after I read his book, I was mad.
Yeah.
Both that I spent the money to buy the book and also that I spent the time reading the book.
Yeah.
Because his book was not worth the paper it was printed on.
And the sad thing is he did have a good story. It's like you said, the story was there, but it just needed restructuring and corrections all over the place.
Right.
But the sad thing is, well, some people, Paulette, no matter what you say to them, you're not going to convince them that it needs a little work.
And I'm going to add this in, too, because you said you're sure he could afford an editor. If you write a book, you can't afford not to have an editor.
Right.
And if that means you wait 6 months while you sock away money to pay for an editor, in order for your book to be successful, people have to be able to read it and stay engaged with it. They can't read it or stay engaged if it's written by somebody who appears to have a third-grade education.
Well, and the main thing is you can also budget for it. That's the other thing, because usually editors will work with you.
Right.
Go ahead, Paulette.
Jan is absolutely 100% right. And the other thing that a lot of times authors don't realize, I don't want to be cliche, but it takes a village. So the author is the creator of the book. The author creates the story. The author is generally an absolutely wonderful storyteller. so the author is the creator of the storyteller, but the editor is the technician.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it takes both people to then create a story or a book that is worth reading for the reader.
Right.
And to Jan's point, if you don't feel like you can afford an editor, then you have no business putting a substandard book into the marketplace.
Right.
Right.
And something else that people have to understand, if you've written a book, you put on a very thick skin the first time somebody reads it and says it's really a great book, except for.
Right.
And then they tell you errors that they see, and they're not professional editors or proofreaders. They're just friends, relatives, what have you.
Right.
So once somebody, and the worst thing you can do for any friend who's written a book after you've read it for them is to hand it back to them and say, that's really a great book, period. You've got to tell them there are errors. You need to get this edited so it will be the success you want.
But you know what? I think a lot of times what happens is when you hand it off to friends and family is they're just so proud of the fact that you accomplished something. They're not even going to try and find anything. That's why you really do need to hand it off to someone who has no association with you whatsoever.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, and the other thing is kind of to the point that we were talking about earlier. An English teacher taught English,
right.
which does not make the English teacher a trained book editor.
Correct.
Absolutely. I can tell you that when I edit a book, I look for, generally speaking, not less than about 75 different issues. And unless you know everything I'm looking for, I look for commas, I look for word usage issues, I look for continuity, I look for consistency. But within all of those individual things, there might be 10 little teeny micro things that I'm looking for. And I'm sorry, an English teacher just doesn't know this.
Well,
nor does your wife or your dad or your neighbor.
Right. Which happened to be the case with the author we were talking about, that his wife, who was a school teacher, is the one who helped edit that book.
Yeah. And it does. It takes a village to make this thing happen. A professional editor's primary connection to the book is the manuscript itself. Your friends are all going to give you wonderful support and advice, especially that English teacher for whom I hope you made cookies. But there's not going to be an approach to the text with the kind of eye for detail that an editor brings. And when my editor, and God love her, when she sent me back the first 3 or 4 pages that I had written, she says, okay, Jan, for the rest of your book, I want you to look for these things. So before you send me the rest of your manuscript, you've already fixed these things. These are the things you need to look for. And commas were my main problem. I had commas in a whole lot of places that they did not belong. Mm-hmm. So it was wonderful that she gave me heads up. So, and my second book is much better than that.
The other thing is that it's important to understand, too, that actually, Paulette, the book that you worked on for me had been edited by a professor at one of the major universities. And I realized that's the book that you edited for me, Paulette, just so you know. And I realized just because this person was a professor at a major university didn't make them an editor.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You have a comment on that, Paulette?
Nothing other than just that's absolutely true. There is no school that you go to become a book editor. There is no training. There is no nothing. Any person on the planet can hang out their shingle and call themselves a book editor. But I can tell you that for me, as many years experience as I have had, I was an avid reader from the time, like I said earlier, that I learned to talk. And so, I've had many, many, many years of experience, and working in the legal field for 14 years before I started my editing career. Working in the legal field, when you're sending a pleading to the Supreme Court, the Supreme Court does not want extra words. You know, the judges in the Supreme Court, and they don't want superfluous, extraneous junk in the pleading.
Right.
So, you know, I have very well trained eyes in terms of what to look for and what should be there, what shouldn't be there. And, you know, even though when you're talking the justices of the Supreme Court and knowing that they don't want a lot of extra flowery language, when an author has written a novel, what many authors don't realize is that it's and there's a saying in fiction writing called show versus tell. So what you want to do is show the reader what you mean as opposed to telling the reader what you mean.
Right.
And showing the reader what you mean means that you have put in some choice description, and it's that description that helps the reader feel as if he is there.
Basically, you're painting a picture with words.
Yes, absolutely. You're painting a picture as opposed to just telling the reader that something happened. Because telling the reader, you know, he got shot in the head, that's boring. So what you need to do is say, you know, the robber pulled the gun out of the holster, got the guy's head in his sights, pulled the trigger, and suddenly brains were splatted all over the wall.
Right.
But
Well-
you could embellish that and embellish it and embellish it, and pretty soon nobody wants to read it either.
Well, yeah, you can go too far
Yes,
the other
You've
way.
got a clean house.
Yeah.
Yes, that's absolutely right. But again, that's where your editor comes in. You know, there's a difference between putting in some really super great description that could be effective in a paragraph, and then taking that and going on and on for 3 pages.
Yeah, it's
Right.
not necessary, right?
Well, one of the things I want to point out that Paulette did with one of my chapters is that it was too long, and I'm glad she pointed that out, because one of the things I think that we don't think about is how much time does someone spend reading a book? So let's, like the young lady at work, she spends her hour reading the book. It's easier when you have a condensed chapter instead of a long narrative that goes on and on and on that they might not get to, because then they think, oh, well, I got to go back to this, or they might not want to leave it, but they have to.
Right.
So that's I did learn that through you, Paulette. I'm going to go into
So glad.
I'm going to go into myth number 3. All editors are the same. No, there are a variety of editing tasks that need to be addressed as a book goes through the publishing process, each of which requires a different set of skills. And we're going to go over each one of those skills. The first one is development. Development editors work with the author to craft the manuscript, looking at structure and argument in the nonfiction or plot, and character in fiction. In traditional publishing, these are usually the acquiring editors. So the first editor is like a development editor. Then you go through what's called a line substantive editor, who also looks at the manuscript as a whole, but generally they don't work as closely with the author and aren't expected to edit as deeply. Then you have the copy editor, who concentrates on the language or copy. They focus on trying to make the style of the manuscript clean and consistent. And then you have proofreaders, who are usually the last folks who look at a book in a gallery or proof form as it's about to go off to the printer. In the case of ebooks, it's about entering the distribution. They're looking purely for misspellings or errors in style, such as improper punctuation, grammar, or formatting. When you're self-publishing, I want to add this. When you're self-publishing, you may not have the opportunity to go through each one of these phases. So when you send it off to an editor, how would you regard the way we handled mine? Like, basically, did you look at all the content as far as what we just discussed, development lines, you know, the substantive part of the line, the copy editing, proofreading, because you did proofread before you actually started the editing?
James, so I feel like I'm probably a little bit different than some other editors, because I do developmental work, substantive work, copy editing work. I give authors everything they need for the one fee that I charge, and I charge a flat fee. When I first started editing 13 years ago, I started having many authors came to me and said, well, first I need this kind of editor, and then I need the other kind, and then I need the last kind. And you know, I had authors telling me I can't pay each different kind of editor $2,000 because, you know, $6,000 or $8,000 is not in my budget. So very early in my career, I realized that it made the most sense for me to provide an author with everything she needs for the one flat fee that I charge. And that way, you know, that leaves money for marketing, publishing, all of the other expenses, cover design that go into actually publishing a book.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I was going to go on and say also that this doesn't even mention the army of professionals beyond that, a craft book, like the manuscript, the layout, the designers, the checkers, the permissions, researchers. And you do a lot of research too. And Paula, do you pay attention to those details? I know you do.
Oh, absolutely. For example, I worked on a book earlier in the year where there was a word or a little short phrase that kind of caught my attention. And so I went out to the internet and discovered that this particular author had borrowed verbatim several paragraphs from another source.
Oh.
And, you know, he didn't realize that you know, that you can't do that. But I realized that. And so, you know, then I had to make a note for him and just, you know, kind of alert him to the fact that, you know, when we're writing a book, we can't borrow information from another source. So even though technically there's nothing in my contract that says that I'm going to go out and do your research for you, I expect that if you're writing a book, you will have done your own research.
Right.
Yes.
But I do huge amounts of research for my authors, and I do that just kind of an extra service because, again, I don't want my author to publish a book and then you know, have somebody come to them and say, you know, if somebody's writing historical fiction and there's, you know, a car being driven in the 1100s Scotland, well, we know that isn't true. So if somebody has many historical references wrong, even though that's not on me, that's going to come back to haunt me.
Yes.
So I provide that extra service for my authors and go ahead and do boatloads of research.
Okay. Well, you know, let's just use my book, for example, because you did edit my book. I used biblical quotes, but that's a little different than what you're talking about because, first of all, there are some things that you can use context of something else, like a biblical quote. Do you agree with that?
Yes, absolutely.
So it does make a difference as to what you're referencing. But if I go out there and I take an excerpt from someone else's book and put it in mine, that's what you're talking about. That's almost like plagiarism because you're actually taking their content.
Yes, and I can tell you that the book that I worked on this year is not the first book that I've had over the course of my career. One thing that authors frequently don't realize, many authors use song lyrics in their books.
All right.
And so I also have to alert authors to the fact that song lyrics are copyrighted and that they can't just borrow any song lyrics that they decide they want to use in their book. You know, I always refer people to the United States Copyright Office and have them look at the fair use laws and just make sure that they're not in violation of copyright laws if they're using song lyrics in their books.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense. That's really important what we just brought up too, because I think a lot of people don't understand you can't just use someone else's. I had a children's book that not a children's book. I wrote a book of weird combinations of foods women crave when pregnant or more, written by two men. And in that book, there were excerpts from different websites that I used, but I had to reword those in the sense that I had to make it in my voice as opposed to what they wrote. But I also did give them credit, though. I still, even though I reworded it, I still put in there where I got this information from. So that's something I wanted to ask you about as well. If you're noting something, wouldn't it be okay to note something if you're trying to lead them to that reference?
Well, James, just simply giving somebody an attribution, that does not absolve you of paying attention to copyright laws.
Okay.
So, for example, if I borrow 3 paragraphs out of your book and then say, this is from the book blah, blah, blah by James Kelly, I'm still in violation of copyright laws.
Oh, okay.
So a simple attribution is not sufficient.
Okay. All right, gotcha. Well, so I don't know where I stand with that book. But I did, like I said, I did reword everything. I put it in my own words, but at the same time, I still wanted to give credit from where I got the information from. So anyway, myth number 4, I'm going to let you take that, Paulette.
Okay. An editor is an editor. So I should just use the cheapest one I can find, right?
Absolutely.
So, I don't know, James, should we start there? Should we read the
Well,
next
yeah,
paragraph?
read that and then we'll talk about that.
Okay. It's your work and your money. So you should budget, and then my opinion is whatever it takes to work with the editor of your choice.
Yeah, but he says to afford, you can afford.
To create the book that has the impact that you are looking for. As mentioned above, there are different kinds of editors who have different skills, and different kinds of editing demand different commitments of time and energy. So cheap is not necessarily better.
Right.
I'm going to charge a lot more to do a long-term, deep developmental edit where I'm working with the author to improve the manuscript at the fundamental level than I will for a simple just before publication proofread where I'm just looking carefully for punctuation, grammar, and style issues.
And that's true. I think that's what happens. A lot of people think, well, I got this quote from this person, I got this quote from that person, so I can just get by with $600. Because they think, well, they're going to... But proofreading isn't always all you need. You need someone who really understands how to structure the book or the chapter or the paragraph and look for syntax. If it's easy to go out there and get what we were talking about, a friend to do it for us. But that's not always the best avenue because they're really not an editor. They're really not looking for the details that an editor should be looking for. And I know you have a lot to say about that, Paulette.
I do. So one of the first things is that authors need to make the investment in themselves and their book. And if authors can look at this as an investment as opposed to, oh my God, I have to give my editor $2,500 and that's just a waste of money. If authors think that they have written a book that should be shown to the world, they need to make the investment to show the best book possible to the world. This is achieved by using a thorough, competent, professional book editor as opposed to your mom or that English teacher. Using the cheapest editor he can find is not going to serve the author well in putting the best possible product into the marketplace. Every author's work deserves not substandard, but superior editing assistance. So the one other thing that I would say is when you're looking for an editor, look for the extras that an author, that the editor provides the author. So a couple of extras that I provide, with my editing fee comes a 1-hour consultation when I give you back your book manuscript. The other thing that I do is I prepare what I call an author letter for all of my authors. And the author letter really details in very specific ways, using examples from the author's own manuscript, how I have edited their books. And this goes to a point that James made earlier. So if you have used the word, and I'm just making this up because all fiction authors use the word walked too many times. So what in narrative form, in paragraph form, in your author letter, I will say something to you like, not only is the word walked overused in your manuscript, but it's not even almost believable that every time somebody perambulates from one place to another, they walked. So people run, people sprint, people dart, people race, people skip, people move slowly. So in the author letter, I give the authors several, and I mean several, probably 20 choices for other words to use besides walked. Like you can say he traipsed into the house, he trudged into the house, he trekked into the house.
Yeah.
Well, a thesaurus has become my best friend lately.
Yes.
Well, and so you might be choosing the cheapest editor, but you also have to ask what you get for that money. In other words, if you're paying a cheap editor $1,500 and getting a cheap edit, does that make more sense than paying an excellent, competent, professional editor $2,000 and getting a book that you're proud to publish at the end of that?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to read myth number 5. Okay, fine. I'll hire an editor. It's like calling a taxi. Take the first one you flag down. The best way to hire the right editor is probably to talk to other writers you know and ask for recommendations. You could also look for a local freelance board or online service such as alance.com. I've encouraged you to look locally first. You don't need to be able to you don't have to meet the editor face to face, but it doesn't hurt, especially in a long-term project. And I want to add something to what he just said. We had a guest on the show. The guests were Rick Talbot and Chris Keaton, and they co-wrote Mosaic. And I want to explain how that worked. The reason I'm bringing this up is because you don't have to go local to necessarily find an editor.
Right.
And what happened here was Chris Keaton is a script writer, and he had this project that he had pitched to a production company, and they said, before we make this a movie, it would make a great novel, and we need you to go out there and create the novel first, because if you can generate a novel based on the script, or the script based on the novel, which is what they would probably sell it as, then what we can do is that, you can gain an audience from the novel.
Right.
So Chris went out and tried to find an editor, and he ended up going with Rick Talbot. Rick Talbot lives on the East Coast. Chris lives in Arizona on the West Coast. And what we found fascinating is until the day they came to this show to do their first radio show about this book that was published, they had not really met.
No, they never met in person.
So that was kind of an interesting show.
Yeah.
That, they kind of met. They had met that day prior to coming to the show, but they basically had met that day and done this interview on the show together. But it took them 7 years to write this book. But what they did is they communicated by messenger, or not even messenger. Email, yeah, basically email. And I don't even think they talked on the phone, they said. It was all email.
All email.
And they edited that book. I mean, it's a great book. Cover's beautiful.
Oh, yeah.
But it's an interesting concept how they did this without ever having met. But Paulette, I've never met you in person. So
I know.
You edited my book without having met you in person.
Well, and so you guys are right. With the advent of email and the internet, that makes the give and take between author and editor just hugely easier. But I can tell you, I have worked with authors all across this country, from Florida to California and everywhere in between. I've worked with several authors internationally. So, my international clients don't generally call me. Although one time I would tell you, I was working with an English woman and she was living in Italy at the time. And one morning, out of the blue, my phone rang at about 2:45 in the morning. And I kind of flew up and answered the phone. And the lady said, "Hello, Paulette." And I knew immediately who it was. So I talked to her. I think we talked for about an hour and 15 minutes or so. And I hung up the phone and went right back to sleep and told myself, well, she apparently did not calculate the time difference correctly, but I didn't care.
Right.
So, and that was very early in my career. That was probably about 2008, 2009 timeframe. So since that time, I have just made the decision that I am on call for my authors 24/7, 365 days a year.
Wow.
Marvelous.
Wow. Well, the thing is like we had Pat Ritter on the show a couple shows back, and he's an Australian author, and we interviewed him from Australia. And what was interesting with him is that he found the person who designed his cover in the United States. We're at a technology is at an age now to where you don't have to be centralized to your location.
Right.
You can actually go anywhere in the world and find people to help you with your work.
Yep.
So like you said, you're in Denver, Colorado, but that doesn't matter where you are. If you're an editor, you can edit a book from anywhere because all you do is just send the manuscript over your email.
Yep.
So or you can download it to Dropbox or many other different places you can go and share that information. So it doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be local anymore. So I don't know where he got this concept, but he must have written this idea several years ago. All right. So also in addition to that, I'm just going to skip part of this. And most likely, no tool will edit exactly the same way or give you the same quote or time frame. Oh, time frame. I want to bring this up. This is important. When you give a time frame, and I'm going to ask you this question. When you give a time frame, Paulette, how accurate are you on your time frame?
I would say I am impeccably accurate. I know that James and I worked with another author, and she had worked with an editor previously, and the editor was, I think, 6 or 8 months delayed getting the manuscript back to the author.
Yeah.
Oh.
And I will tell you a funny short story. In 2011, in one weekend in November, I fell and broke one of my feet and both of my arms.
Oh my gosh.
And it just so happened that I was working with an author in Durango, Colorado, which is 3 or 4 hours south of here. And he had told me that he was going to be in Denver on the weekend of December 2nd. So I told him, I said, I will have your manuscript done for you by that time. Let's meet in person. We'll go over your author letter. And so it was 2 weeks before that I fell and broke both of my arms. So for the first week, I did nothing but lay in bed and cry, not only because it hurt, but because I couldn't do anything.
Yeah.
Right.
But I would tell you that the second week, I literally put one casted arm on top of the other and typed an entire 45-page author letter with one finger.
Oh
Wow.
my gosh.
And I met him by deadline on December 2nd. I couldn't open the door to get into the Starbucks where we met,
Yeah.
but I was there with bells on with a completed manuscript and with a completed author letter.
I
That's
think
dedication.
Yeah, and I want to add something to this too. A lot of times when editors are using a program to edit with, and I don't know what it's called, but Paulette, when you're using Word and there's that whole program where you can accept or reject
Track changes.
Those are timed. So if someone's stalling you, they need to understand, as the editor, they need to understand. This is for the editors. All those have a time date.
Yes.
So when you stall and you say that I've been working on it, but once that gets back to the author, they're going to know if you really worked on it because it shows the time and date that you worked on it. So you don't want to fudge that. You really don't. You want to make sure you're being honest. If I can understand how an editor can get bogged down if they're in demand and if they get, 5 or 6 projects, and I understand the concept of not wanting to turn one away because you want to make money. But at the same time, you need to be honest with the author because what we've done as authors is a lot of times we've preset a time that we want to get this book out.
Right.
Now, I'm one of those who I'm very flexible, but let's say I want to set it up for May of next year. Once I've set a deadline and I've told people and I'm going to try and set up a book launch, I need to have everyone on board with me, including the editor, to try and get it at least as close to the deadline as possible. But when you're stalling and you're going 3 or 4 months behind, and then you keep saying, I've been working on it, but, and then when I get that back and I see a date that's entirely different than what you told me, it kind of like deters me from thinking, do I want to use you again because you kind of lied to me?
Right. Yeah, don't lie.
Yeah, I would rather you just tell me. Like if you'd say to me, Paulette, I broke both my arms and a foot, which is a pretty good excuse.
Yeah. I'll be back with you in 6 weeks.
Yeah. Then at least I can understand and comprehend that,
James, I would tell you, I have been late on the deadline and I always promise an author when I'll have their book back to them when I give them their fee quote. And I was 2 weeks late one time in my whole entire 13 years. And the reason for that is because I was working on a political book that was real life. It was about a real life political campaign that happened shortly before this most recent election. And so I did a lot of extra work for that author, in part because I thought it was critically important
to get it
that
out.
he have all of his facts straight, that no names were spelled wrong, and all of that. So I made a lot of extra charts and things for him, and I did a lot of extra research for him, again, just because since his book was about a real life political campaign, I just thought it was absolutely essential that everything in that book be as close to 100% correct as we could make it.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to let Jen take myth number 6. And Jen, you don't have to read all of it because we're getting close to the end here.
Okay. I hired an editor who worked with me for months to rewrite the manuscript. Now it's ready for publication. Yeah, no, it's not. No, it's not. You need to reread it. You need to have it proofread. You need to share it and get other people's opinion.
Right.
Make sure that, because anybody can miss anything.
Right. There, and especially when you're rewriting it and you're putting it into typesetting, because when the editor sends it back, it's usually double spaced. So you need to put it into a format, and you can mess something up.
Yes.
So you do need to look at it again. That doesn't mean just because it's edited, it's finished.
Right.
You do need to get fresh eyes to look at it. Paulette, do you look at the manuscript again once it's edited? Like, say I send it back to you, which I haven't done yet, and I send it back to you. Would you look at it again? How does that work?
Yes, absolutely. And there's a very good reason for that. I always encourage my authors to send their manuscript back to me to review, edit, revise the second draft. And the biggest reason for that is because when authors make their revisions, sometimes, if they're deleting a sentence, they delete a sentence and the first 2 words of the following sentence. without
Yes,
realizing it.
Yes.
Or, for example, if I've indicated to an author that there's an inconsistency in the book, maybe in chapter 3 it's a red Corvette, and in chapter 5 it's a black Porsche. So they may have changed the red Corvette to a black Porsche in chapter 5,
Right.
but then they forgot to change it to a black Porsche through all the subsequent chapters of the book.
Yes.
So we're still left with inconsistencies.
Well, the last
So-
thing is, I'm sorry. Well, I was going to say we're getting really close to the end. Myth number 7 is the editor marked up my manuscript, but I have no idea what the notes are about. Dictation, series commas. The editor is marking it up. Honestly, truly, no. When an editor has marked things up, it's exactly what you're talking about now. You still have to look for changes. And I'm going to let you finish that real quick, and then we're going to go to the last minute of the show, Paulette. So do you agree with that?
Yes, absolutely. One of the things that's so interesting to me, I talked to an ex-NFL player about, he wrote a book, and I met him in June. And one of the things that he told me is that he did not want to work with an editor because he was afraid that his editor would change everything about his book. And my job is not to change your book and make it sound like it was written by me. I have no reason to make anything up. My job is solely to help you put the best book out there. So if you have punctuation errors, if you have grammar mistakes, if you have continuity issues, if you have word usage issues, if you have redundancy issues, you are paying me to help you take care of those things. I don't have any reason to make anything up. It's not like I insert 12 of my own paragraphs into your manuscript because I have nothing better to do.
Right.
Right. Well, we're down to the last minute of the show here.
Wow.
So I would like to thank our guest, Paulette K. Kennis, along with my panelist, Janet Corsi. And again, you can find Paulette. We have on the video, if you go to the video portion, you'll see her phone number there. You can also find her on Facebook. She does not have a website. I want to mention this real fast. And the reason you did have one, but someone had hacked it. We actually discussed that yesterday, and I had that happen to me as well, so I understand that. So in any case, Paulette, they can find you on Facebook. They can give them your phone number again.
Okay, so the name of my company is Platinum Editing Group, and my telephone number is 303-517-7340. And again, I'm available to my authors 24/7.
That's
All right.
marvelous.
Well, you can find, first of all, I'd like to thank Paulette. I'd like to thank Janet Corsi for being here as well. And you can find the video of our past shows on YouTube at youtube.com/aspects of writing, which is all one word. Or you can go to our website. It's always easier. Just go to aspectsofwriting.com. And by the way, Paulette, I've posted your picture there with a link to your Facebook page, so they can just click on your picture and then go to Facebook. There you will also find links to the syndicated show on iHeartRadio, iTunes, Roku TV, AMFM247.com. We're live on Saturdays at 1 o'clock on AMFM247.com. In addition, we archive all of our shows on Aspects of Writing after it's aired. So you can go all week long and listen to the past show in case you missed it. And that's the video version as well as the audio version. And then what we do is we shuffle it to where once we put the next guest coming in, the old show's archived there for 1 week, and then you'll also know who's coming up the next week. Yeah. So until next week, this is your host, James Kelly, reminding you, if you can dream it, you can write it. Thank you, Paulette. Thank you, Janet.
So nice to meet you, Paulette.
Thank you, Janet. It was so nice to meet you, Jan.
And I promise I'll get back to you, Paulette, with mine as soon as I'm finished.
Okay, James, when is this particular episode going to air?
Well, I'm going to answer that after we get off the air here. I'll give you that calendar.
Oh, perfect.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much, guys. Bye.
Bye.